excited. Looking forward to your contribution. Hello. It's so nice to have you here. It's the first day of Republica. It's 7:30. You're still here. Very happy to have you. You could also be sitting outside and be drinking beer, but I think we've prepared something for you that's worth listening to. The four of us worked on the Atlas for Civil Society together last winter. This is what I'm holding here. We published it together with Civicus. What this is about is something I'll be talking about later. An atlas like this looks like kind of like a specialized publication when you look at it first. That might include a lot of important information and maybe advice, but it also includes a lot of romanticism, a lot of work, a lot of passion, many debates, and the four of us. We had a one-day workshop, the four of us, where we talked about this atlas in the very beginning and where we very passionately debated which things should be included. The focus of this edition is digitalization, and so Brot für die Welt, that's where I work. I'm a part-time expert who works there. And so we also have, we've also invited two experts from Netzpolitik.org, a German publication focused on internet policy. Christine, why don't you talk about what you do, what your job is at Brot für die Welt? Yeah, so I'm part of the section Politics and Peace, and I'm basically concerned with freedom rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of opinion, and which possibilities civil society, such as associations, NGOs, individual activists, have to advocate. That it's important for us because we support civil society organizations across the world, and for, I think at this point, over 10 years, we've essentially found that they're obstructed in doing their work more and more. Both personally, but also the organizations as organizations. And that's also why we published this atlas, and I am in charge of this atlas. Chris, you're from Netzpolitik.org, and so we are very happy to have had you as a contributor for this atlas that really contributed important impetus to this book. What do you do at Netzpolitik.org? Yeah, so I've been an editor there since 2017. We report about anything that's basic rights and freedom rights in the digital space. And so just as a quick background, before that I co-founded a feminist magazine. So I still have this feminist intersectional approach that I also use to look at these digitization topics and really anything. And accordingly, one thing I'm also concerned with, or I'm really especially concerned with topics at Netzpolitik.org that concern how, for example, marginalized people might be affected. So you're also at Netzpolitik. What's your approach to digitization? Oh, I should maybe take the mic. So I wanted to ask Ingo what his approach to digitalization is, and he wrote a text that talks about this very interestingly. So he wrote one of the introductions to one of our focus points, and he wrote, "The internet cannot be censored. The decentral organization of this infrastructure makes it immune to control." That's at least that's what people believed. So diversity of voices would almost on its own lead to democracy and to an end to discrimination. Citation, we creating a world where every single person anywhere in the world can express their own opinion and stance without having to fear being forced to shut down is something that the U.S. civil rights activist, U.S. activist John Perry Barlow wrote in his Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace. Why are you at Netzpolitik.org, and why did you start the text this way? Yeah, so I'm a communication scientist, and I've been at Netzpolitik.org for 6 years with a focus on data, power, and the kind of structural digital change in the public, and that includes regulation of the internet. And this introductory statement that you read is something that really influenced a lot of us who kind of work at this intersection of civil society and journalism, the belief or the knowledge about the potential and the possible utopias that are attached to the internet despite all of its problems. So accordingly, in our work, we're mostly concerned with kind of the defensive work. I mean, of course, you know how the text is going to continue if I am saying that this narrative used to exist. Of course, it's not that strong anymore in this day and age. So that's really what drives me, like really using the internet to work in service of the people, not just for control, but instead for emancipation, for freedom, for sustainability maybe, and yeah, justice. Okay, so we have this massive task that we had this one-day workshop and these 200 pages. We have to put all of that into half an hour. So we're just going to kind of shine a light on a few points. So what is this Atlas for Civil Society, and what does it? You can see on this map what this means. It has several. It's colored based on different codings. What do these colors mean? Very briefly. Okay, yeah. So these are different classifications. So on the left, you have a very small explanation. So it's essentially kind of a traffic light system. So dark green means open. So that essentially means where basic freedoms are protected, civil society can act and advocate. There are almost no restrictions. For example, you can tell that Germany is dark green as well, even though some people might say maybe that Germany isn't entirely open. There are 20 points that are given to each country. So this point-based system from Civicus, which goes from 80 to 100. Wait, no. So no, it's 60 to 80. So dark yellow is limited, and then we have repressed, that's dark orange, and the real dark red is closed. And it's not really a ranking like the one that Reporters Without Borders does, but it's more different categories. It's closed, as you can tell. That's a lot of countries in the Middle Eastern region and Asia, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa. And these are countries where there's really a very high level of censorship, surveillance, where independent civil society is essentially working in the underground or from exile. So just to be very briefly, freedom means freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. So essentially these rights that you need to be independent and act independently in civil society. So let's now get to the specific results for 2021, which is the year that we're talking about. So one thing that I found really disturbing is that 3% of people across the world only live in countries that have open civil societies. And it's increasingly few. This is the 5th year that we've published the Atlas. And you can compare 2021 and 2022. So there's, again, this number has decreased even further when you just look at kind of pure numbers in terms of population. But what we're really interested in, of course, is how many people are affected. And one thing that's particularly scary is that 88% of people live in countries where civil society is restricted, suppressed, or closed. And 70% live in repressed or closed societies. And repressed and closed, that's more than 2/3 just in these last two categories. And those really are societies where there's no freedom of expression, no freedom of the press, like a high level of violence when you essentially have an assembly. And yeah, that's really the scary thing, how many people are in those last two categories. And these are the results of the people who rose in the ranking and who dropped in the ranking. And Civicus does this in a lot of detail. So there's very intense observations, and those are analyzed at the end of the year. So 2021, we had 14 countries that went down in their rating. Yeah. So, and there we have 3 countries in the EU as well, which is always disturbing. Belgium, the Czech Republic, and the Czech Republic turned from open countries to limited countries. And one thing that's especially problematic is Poland from limited to repressed. So with Poland, we now have 2 EU countries that fit in this category. And in Poland, that's particularly because of the end to the division of power and the justice reform. You know about that if you've been reading media reports, have been watching the situation where essentially judges kept being taken out of their positions, kept being replaced, and where the rule of law as a whole has suffered in Poland. And what's specifically problematic is the abolition of sexual and reproductive rights of women who, when they went onto the streets, really were criminalized, were met with violence, and that's the result that's what led to this result.
So Mongolia is the only country that has improved and moved up into the impaired category. And that's also a theme here. Many countries were downgraded, only one has improved. And one of the reasons we can name is that civil society and the human rights organizations within Mongolia have worked together with the government on a bill to protect human rights activists. So the country has now agreed to better protect the rights of people that fight for human rights, which has been perceived very positively. Okay, so we had half a year to collect the atlas. Now we have to hurry up a little bit because we already have 7:45. You were talking about marginalized groups before that you are looking at specifically. And the technical term is shrinking space. It's the shrinking spaces where you can act, for example, in freedom of expression, and that there's more and more restrictions imposed. You can also formulate it positively. We can call it the enabling space. So that's the space where there is support and recognition and valuation and possibilities to participate in civil society. Just quickly on the women, that's also closest to what I mentioned about Poland earlier. If you're interested in how people that are advocating for women's rights are being oppressed, I recommend you read the 2022 Atlas, because we looked exactly at this nexus, the throwback that we saw in the gender movement correlated to the shrinking space. And just a small side note on the instruments of repression here that Civicus has documented, that are also validated, and you can see it's in the reporting period between November 2020 and October 2021. There's been especially a lot of
Schikanierung sehr hoch gerankt ist. Immerhin 163
arrests of activists and journalists, a lot of
sehr viele Menschen. Wenn ein repressives Gesetz erlassen wird, dann ist da ja nicht nur eine Person.
So when there is a repressive law, that doesn't just affect a single person, but it really affects the entire society. So in the Atlas, we use 4 countries in this universe, when it comes to this universe of digitalization, where there is specific repression. We have an entire chapter on Ukraine, where we discuss how even before the war, there were strategic, well-planned, targeted disinformation campaigns that really try to drive this entire society into kind of insanity. With regards to Mexico, it was that chapter was about surveillance. If you're interested in that, you can come find us after. We have a few copies with us. This is not for selling. You can also find this online. And we're not just trying to tell this. We really think this is worth looking at. So let's get back to Chris, and we're going to jump to this focus topic. For Mexico, we spoke about Pegasus a lot.
Okay, I thought it was very interesting to follow up to what you said earlier, Christine, that within the EU, especially Poland and Hungary are the 2 states that have been downgraded now and slipped into the red, because I think it shows pretty well. Both Hungary was the first country where it became known that they used Pegasus. Pegasus is a state Trojan, a surveillance software produced by an Israeli company called NSO Group, and that is supposedly only distributed to state actors and state agencies. And according to the description, of course, should only be used for example, to counter terror or prevent terrorism or other heavy crimes. So last year we had a large leak where Amnesty International, together with a consortium of international journalists, received a list of phone numbers that were targeted by Pegasus, and where you could then see who is being surveilled by the spyware. Journalists all over the globe have researched this, and Mexico is one of the countries that were most affected, where politicians and journalists and priests were being surveilled by Pegasus. So this interview is highly recommended. This activist describes what that feels like and what it did with her to learn about the surveillance. And from a perspective of the European Union, maybe the shocking thing was that already back then it was clear that Hungary also uses this cyber weapon, and among others to target critical journalists within their own country. Now we know also Poland did this, and they're not the only countries either. Spain did as well, and more and more revelations about more and more countries are coming to light. Countries that have used Pegasus to surveil a lot of people where it should never have happened. And you mentioned the software is made in Israel, so you flip through the Atlas, a few pages forward you find a still shocking number. There's been a research from Privacy International from 2018. We're currently talking a lot about this one Israeli company and other Israeli companies, but a lot of those companies that sell surveillance technology are situated within the EU, and until very recently were mostly unregulated in who they could export the surveillance technologies to from within the EU. Amnesty International released a report last year where it became clear that at least 3 companies in the EU have delivered facial recognition technology to, for example, China from within the EU, and where it's clear what this facial recognition technology will be used for example, to oppress the Uyghur minority. And there was a large discussion within the EU to put these cyber surveillance tools onto a list of dual-use goods that may not be simply exported without restriction, but it took a very long time and was blocked primarily by Germany within the Council. In one text, you describe very clearly how algorithms are now intruding into the lives of people and make decisions with far-reaching consequences. This graphic illustrates this a little bit. Can you try to explain in a few words what you've seen? Yes, so when we looked at which topics do we want to cover in this focus on digital platforms and digitization, one of the key topics for me also at Netzpolitik is algorithmic forecast prognoses, and we know that especially the big platforms use recommendation algorithms, but more and more state agencies are using these algorithms as well against their own population. So 2 cases that demonstrate this pretty clearly in the last few years was, on the one hand, what you can see here on this diagram. In the Netherlands, there was a system called SIRI, which performed a risk scoring for social security fraud, and that looked at a confluence of different factors and then assigned a probability that maybe there is a case of social security fraud or otherwise defrauding the state was increased And then single communities there increased their controls. The people affected were not informed by this. They didn't know that they were on these lists. And Ingo, you also reported on this. Maybe you can add a little more detail later, but it was one of the more brazen cases where it's also been a court decision that this was a case of data discrimination with a racist component as well, because this component, the software component, primarily targeted poor districts that are primarily populated by non-white people. And one of the indications for the supposed risk was, for example, double citizenship. And there was a court decision that this cannot continue in that way, but it took a very long time. It was in use for many years. And the other example is the IMS algorithm from Austria, which was used by the employment office to categorize job seekers into 3 categories and then decide who we should even spend any money on, who's statistically most probable to find a job again. And they just did this. And the interesting part, I think, is that we are at a very interesting point right now, because we have a situation within the EU where it's possible, where there's no real limitations or regulations what state authorities can do with these algorithmic systems, these recommendation and forecast systems, or what things they have to do before they may be.
Du hast, finde ich, genug erzählt und ich möchte mit dir auf jeden Fall noch... Nein, das klang so, um Gottes Willen. Um Gottes Willen.
Okay.
Der uncharmanteste Satz des heutigen Tages.
So you said a lot, and there's a few more things that I want to follow up on.
Erzählt, hat ein Wort gefehlt. Aber ich will die letzten 6 Minuten nutzen, bevor wir von der...
And I want to use the last 6 minutes before we get kicked off the stage to quickly talk with you about something that I found very important in the Atlas,
Die Sammelwut der Tech-Konzerne agieren...
where you talk about the data collection mania of the big platform companies.
eingebrannt hat. Was meinst du damit?
And that burned itself into my mind. What do you mean with that specifically? So it's not so much about the data collection mania, but it's more about the big platform companies. And we've seen it last year thanks to Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower. And Facebook is a very important platform for the political discourse, for the online discourse. And they have a functionality that their algorithms prefer certain types of content and give them more exposure. And the simple proxy for that is just the interaction rate. So everything that creates a lot of interaction is rewarded with higher reach, and that means that controversial or polarizing statements that get a lot of blowback, that are scandalizing and emotionalizing people, and get disproportionate exposure. And so the question is this really the right mechanism for how we want the political arena to work, for the political discourse? And also we see that in both Western democracies, we have problems with the results from these algorithms, and they're not the sole cause for hate speech being posted online, but they keep reinforcing them and strengthening them. And we also see that platforms, especially Facebook, have trouble moderating this content. And it's especially obvious if you look at the global south. Facebook, or Meta as they're called nowadays, has invested to reach new markets in the global south, in India, in the Philippines. And there's a lot of people that say Facebook is the same as the internet. People don't perceive the internet outside of Facebook. And what we see in the numbers, Facebook spends very little money for fact-checking and content moderation in these regions. I think 87% of the fact-checking budget are being spent in the US, but they only have about 20% of users or less than that. So see a very large disbalance. For example, in Ethiopia, we've seen there is like four content moderators that don't even have the appropriate language skills, that don't speak all the languages that are most spoken in the country. The algorithms don't understand the language. So this principle of moving fast and breaking things, Facebook has conquered markets, has entered market and became very important for the political discourse, but really didn't give a fuck about what consequences that might have. In the same way that Instagram is maybe toxic for the psyche of young people, especially young girls, Facebook knows also from their own internal studies that the platform is toxic for the democratic climate of discourse. Okay, we have 3 more minutes. Ingo was talking about the Global South. Brot für die Welt has partners in 100 partners, and we would like to send you off with a good feeling. So just 2 quick spotlights on how and where organizations that you work with also make the net a better place. So I think most obvious during the pandemic, globally speaking, in 2020, there was a lot of things that were moved into the digital sphere. For example, we had one organization in Ukraine that managed to help trauma patients digitally using multiplicators and social workers and teachers, and managed to organize the support digitally and help people. And we have one great partner organization in South Africa running campaigns, and that also shows the limits of the digital, because they're working mostly with women on the countryside. And they said for us, especially text messaging is important, because many people don't have internet on their cell phones, or they cannot afford smartphones. And text messaging, SMS, and also calls can be used to start and sustain a lot of campaigns and get the voices of these marginalized women into the parliament in Cape Town and make their problems visible. So that's a few examples. So we sprinted through this atlas with you once. Christina has 5 copies with her, and if you come up to the stage now, we can get one. One more thing, in fall this year, we're planning a big evening event in Berlin. If you're from Berlin, or if you will be in Berlin in autumn, keep your eyes open. Will be big. We want to spend some more time and dive deeper into what we learn about civil society when we research them and look at them through the lens of Civicus and Brot für die Welt, and in this case, Netzpolitik.org. Thank you very much, all 3 of you, for this great half hour. Thank you for being here. And we are done, and you can kick us off the stage. Thank you. Have a good evening.